Some people say modern life has freed women from old chains. They post polished photos of perfect breakfasts and shiny rings, and talk about empowerment as if the word alone could erase 1,000 years of being owned, bartered, and silenced. But I sit here in my wooden house at the edge of the pines, watching the evening light fade over the hills, and I know that no era, no slogan, has ever fully protected a woman from the hunger of a man who believes he is owed her body and her quietness. Before I start, I want to greet everyone listening to Grandma's stories today. I'm Rose Ellen Carter, and if this is your first time here, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel. You may think you've heard tragic stories before, but mine is woven from threads so dark they will make you question what you call decency. I invite you to stay until the end. Maybe you'll leave with your own certainties a little cracked. Tonight, I feel the weight of all the winters behind me. My hands don't grip like they once did, and my voice sometimes breaks without warning, but my mind is clear, and before my last days slip away, I have decided not to let this truth die sealed in my chest. I have no need for pity, no desire for absolution. I simply want to be remembered for everything I survived, everything I chose, and everything I lost. I was born in a cabin so small you could hear a mouse cross the floor. 6 children slept shoulder to shoulder on quilts that smelled of damp wood. My mother, Naomi, was the sort of woman who rarely looked you in the eye, and when she did, her gaze was tired. My father, Samuel Carter, was known across the valley for 2 things: the way he could break a horse in an afternoon, and the way he drank himself mean after sundown. I was the 5th child, the only one with hair the color of embers. When I was little, I thought maybe that made me special. My grandmother said red hair was a blessing from God. But as I grew, I learned it was more a brand than a gift. It drew eyes I didn't want. It whispered to people that I was different, that maybe I wasn't truly my father's child. By the time I was 14, I could haul a bucket of well water without spilling a drop. I could gut a chicken faster than my brothers. I knew how to keep my head down and my mouth closed when father stumbled in reeking of whiskey. But nothing I learned prepared me for the morning my father came back from town with a folded paper in his fist. He said I was promised. That was the word he used, like it was a blessing instead of a sentence. Promised to a man more than twice my age, a widower with a broad face and eyes as flat as winter ponds. Thomas Braden owned more cattle than anyone else in 3 counties, and he had lost his wife the year before. People said he was ready for a new woman to cook his meals and bear his heirs. And so my father accepted a tidy sum and a handshake, and my life was set on a track I could not leave. The morning I left home, my mother pressed a scrap of cloth into my palm. It was part of the dress she had worn as a girl, a small, faded piece that smelled faintly of soap. She didn't say much, only that I should mind my place and keep my head down. My brothers didn't look at me as I climbed onto the wagon. The road to the Braden Ranch was rutted and long. I remember thinking how quiet Thomas was beside me on the seat, his large hand resting near my knee, never moving but always there, like a warning. I told myself it would be all right, that maybe he would be kinder in private. I was still so young, too young to know how men can be. When we arrived, I saw the house, big and square, with a porch that sagged a little in the middle. The wind smelled of cattle and dust. A girl stood on the steps, her arms folded tight across her chest. Miriam, his daughter from the first marriage. She looked at me with a contempt so sharp it made my skin prickle. Thomas showed me inside, pointed to the kitchen, the pantry, the room where I would sleep. He did not ask if I was tired from the journey. He did not ask if I was afraid. That first night, he came to me when the house was dark and silent. He did what he believed he had paid for, and when he left, I lay staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside me break clean in 2. No one spoke of what happened in that house. The neighbors nodded when they saw me in town. Miriam watched every step I took, her eyes full of resentment. I scrubbed floors, cooked meals, mended clothes. I learned to keep my voice low and my thoughts quieter still. But there are things that will not stay buried, no matter how hard you press them down. And there are truths that rise, year after year, demanding to be spoken aloud. Tonight, I will begin telling all of it, piece by piece, so that you, whoever you are, wherever you sit listening, will understand how a girl becomes a woman, and how a woman survives when everything she believes in is burned away. If you are still here with me, thank you. Stay, listen, because this is only the beginning. The days that followed felt like they were wrapped in heavy cloth, muffling every sound and every feeling. I moved through that big house as if I were only borrowing air, never quite belonging to any room or any hour. Thomas rose before dawn each morning, his boots thudding across the floorboards while I lay in bed pretending to sleep. Sometimes I listened to him coughing in the kitchen, the roughness in his throat a reminder that even the strongest men carried weakness somewhere inside them. But I never mistook that for gentleness. Miriam made sure I understood my place. She had a habit of coming into the kitchen while I was washing dishes or stirring the pot of beans, and standing so close behind me I could feel her breath on my neck. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words were like needles. She would say things like, "You think you're clever, don't you? Or he'll get tired of you just like he did the last one." Sometimes she called me a charity case. Other times she called me something worse. I never answered her. I had learned early that silence was safer than any argument. That first winter on the ranch was the coldest I could remember. Snow pressed against the windows like a restless hand. The wind wailed through the gaps in the planks, and the stove in my small room was too feeble to keep me warm. At night, I lay under quilts that smelled of old wool, and whispered whatever prayers I could remember. I didn't ask God for kindness anymore. I only asked for enough strength to see morning. It was during one of those long nights that I realized I was carrying a life inside me. I had no knowledge of such things beyond what the older women had murmured when I was little, but I felt it as surely as I felt the blood in my veins, a slow swelling, a different heaviness, a flicker of something almost like hope. Though I tried to crush it before it could grow, I told no one. Not Miriam, not Thomas, not the woman who came once a month with supplies from town. I kept the secret under my ribs like a coal I couldn't afford to let burn out. As the weeks passed, my belly grew too obvious to hide. One evening, as I bent over to sweep the ashes from the hearth, Thomas stood watching me from the doorway. His face was unreadable. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't touch me or even step closer. He simply turned away, his boots scraping the floor, and left me there with my heart beating so hard I thought it might split open. Miriam was not so restrained. She came into the kitchen the next morning, her arms crossed tight across her chest. She looked me over as if I were a sack of grain she meant to inspect for mold. She asked if I was proud of myself. I said nothing. My hands stayed busy with the dough I was kneading, but inside I felt the old fear rising, thick and choking. She called me a thief of names and a crow picking at the scraps of her mother's memory. I looked up then, just for a moment, and saw something flicker in her eyes, something that almost looked like sadness before it twisted back into contempt. When the baby came, it was the middle of the night. Snow fell in thick curtains against the windows, and the world felt wrapped in a cold so deep it seemed it might never thaw. I labored alone, biting my lip to keep from crying out. I didn't want Miriam or Thomas to hear me, to know I was vulnerable in that way, but when dawn finally slipped across the floorboards, a small girl lay in my arms, her face pink and her hair as red as mine. I named her Lucy, though no one asked me to record it on any paper. She was simply Lucy because that was the only name that felt right on my tongue. For a few days, I let myself believe she might be enough to fill the hollow spaces inside me. I rocked her in the quiet hours, watching her tiny fingers curl and uncurl. I thought perhaps, in some small measure, I had finally made something that belonged only to me. But of course, nothing in that house was truly mine. When Thomas came into my room to look at her, he didn't reach out. He stared a long time, then said in his slow, flat voice that she would never carry his name. She would have a roof over her head, food in her belly, but she would not be counted as his. After he left, I felt something in my chest fold over itself and go silent. Still, I did what I knew how to do. I rose each day before the frost melted from the window panes. I wrapped Lucy in blankets and carried her as I went about the chores. I fed the chickens, fetched water, scrubbed the kitchen table until my knuckles were raw. All the while, Miriam watched from the doorway. I never knew if she pitied me or despised me, and maybe it was both. One afternoon, near the end of winter, I stood at the kitchen sink, Lucy asleep in a basket at my feet. Outside, the snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing the brittle grass underneath. I thought of my mother then, how she'd sent me away without so much as a blessing, and I wondered if she ever felt the cold in her bones the way I did. I didn't know that the thaw would bring with it the end of everything I had learned to endure. But sometimes, when you have been buried under ice for so long, you almost forget that the breaking comes not with a shout but with a quiet crack. That was how it began, the undoing of the life I had been forced to build. And though I couldn't see it yet, that crack was spreading through the walls around me, ready to let something in I could never have prepared for. Spring crept into the valley with a reluctant warmth, the kind that took weeks to melt the last crusts of ice along the fence posts. I used to think the thaw would bring relief, but that year it only made me uneasy. When the snow was gone, there was nothing left to hide the footprints, the old scars in the yard where Thomas's boots had worn paths I dared not cross. Lucy grew stronger by the day. She learned to lift her head and grasp my finger, her tiny mouth soft as a petal. Sometimes in the evenings, after the kitchen was clean and Miriam had retreated to her room, I would hold her near the window and whisper songs I remembered from my own childhood. Her eyelids fluttered as she listened, and I wondered if she could feel the same hunger I did, a yearning for something beyond these walls. It was on such a night that Thomas came home later than usual. I heard the wagon long before it turned into the yard, the slow groan of wheels over thaw-softened ground. My breath caught as I watched from the dark. He climbed down without speaking, and instead of going to the barn to unhitch the horse, he came straight for the house. When he stepped inside, he smelled of stale tobacco and wet leather. His eyes moved to the cradle, where Lucy slept, then up to me. He looked tired, but his voice was as flat as ever when he said that a lawyer would be coming in the morning to inventory his property. I felt the floor shift under me as the meaning settled in my bones. I asked him why a lawyer needed to come at all. He didn't answer. He walked past me to the table, unbuttoned his coat, and sat heavily. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said that his health had been failing, that there were matters to arrange. He spoke as though he were reading a ledger, each word measured and dry. I tried to feel pity, but all I could think was that no inventory would count me among his possessions. When he finally looked at me, there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, a weariness so complete it made him look older than I had ever known him to be. He asked if I was content with what he had provided. I swallowed hard and said I had never expected more than what I was given. That was the closest I could come to honesty without opening wounds best left hidden. He nodded, as if that were enough, and stood to go to bed. The door closed behind him with a hollow sound. I sat alone by the stove, the low flame casting shadows across the floor, and I felt the cold return to my hands even though the air had begun to warm outside. The next morning, a carriage arrived carrying a man in a brown wool suit. He stepped down with the stiff posture of someone accustomed to being respected. He introduced himself as Mr. Carver and said he would be making an official record of the Braden estate. Miriam hovered in the doorway, her arms folded. Her eyes flicked over me and Lucy with a disdain that needed no words. Mr. Carver took out a notebook and walked from room to room with Thomas trailing behind, pointing to each piece of furniture, every iron pot and plow blade. He never once gestured to Lucy's cradle. He never acknowledged me beyond the first polite nod. To him, we were no more significant than the soot on the hearth. I tried not to watch them as they moved through the house, but it was impossible to ignore the quiet reckoning taking place. Each item was weighed, named, assigned a place in an order that did not include me. I felt like a ghost witnessing my own erasure. When they finished, Mr. Carver closed his book and spoke to Thomas in low tones I couldn't catch. Miriam listened intently, her expression shuddered. Whatever was being decided, I knew it would shape the rest of my life. Later that day, Thomas called me to the parlor. I carried Lucy in my arms, her head resting on my shoulder. He didn't rise from his chair when I entered. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing. He cleared his throat and said that when his time came, the land would go to Miriam and her brothers. He paused, as though expecting me to protest, but I stayed silent. Then he added that there would be a small sum set aside for me, enough to last a year if I was careful. He looked at Lucy and said he hoped I would use it wisely. His voice held no warmth, no regret, just a cold finality that made my throat tighten. I thanked him because I did not know what else to do. He inclined his head slightly, as though a transaction had been concluded. For the rest of the day, I moved through my chores as if I were sleepwalking. I tried to imagine where I would go when that year of charity ran out, but the future was as blank as fresh snow. That night, I lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. Lucy shifted against me, her breath soft on my skin. I pressed my lips to her hair and made a promise I didn't yet know how to keep. I told her we would find a place where no one could tally our worth on a page. A place where her name would belong to her alone, not to the man who had refused to claim her. Outside, the thaw was finally complete. The earth was bare again, raw and waiting. I felt something inside me stir a defiance so small it barely had shape, but it was there all the same. Even in a life built from someone else's decisions, a woman could still choose one thing: she could refuse to vanish. After that conversation in the parlor, nothing in the house looked quite the same. The chairs, the rugs, the framed photographs of Thomas's first wife, they all felt like silent witnesses to my eviction before it had even happened. I walked from room to room in the early mornings, while the others still slept, memorizing the grain of the floorboards, the smell of ash in the corners, the sound of Lucy's breathing against my shoulder. I wanted to fix it all in my mind, as if I could carry the memory with me when everything else was gone. Thomas spoke little to me after the lawyer's visit. His days grew slower, as though he was drifting away from the life he had guarded so fiercely. Sometimes I wondered if he felt any remorse, but he never offered an apology, and I never asked for one. Whatever regret he carried was locked behind the same expressionless face he had shown me since the day I arrived. Miriam, on the other hand, seemed to find a new purpose in the knowledge that the ranch would be hers. She moved through the rooms like a watchman, inspecting the pantry, the ledgers, the stables. She spoke to me only when she had to, and when she did, her voice was cool as river stones. If she caught me lingering too long in the hallway, or pausing to soothe Lucy, she would sigh in that impatient way that made me feel like a stray dog underfoot. One afternoon, when the sun was pale and thin across the fields, Miriam came to the kitchen while I was shelling peas. She stood by the doorway without speaking, her shadow long on the floorboards. I didn't look up until she cleared her throat. She asked if I had thought about where I would go when Thomas was gone. I told her I hadn't made any plans yet. She tilted her head, studying me the way a person might study a stain they meant to scrub away. Then she said it would be best if I didn't linger once the will was settled, that people would talk if I did. I kept my eyes on the peas, my hands moving steadily, my heart thudded against my ribs, but my voice came out even when I told her I understood. She waited as if expecting me to plead or protest, but I stayed silent. When she left, I heard her footsteps echo in the hall, brisk and certain. For a moment, I envied her that certainty, even if it was rooted in cruelty. Spring turned to early summer, and the pastures grew thick with new grass. Lucy learned to sit on her own, her small hands reaching for anything bright. Sometimes, in the quiet afternoons, I carried her to the edge of the fields and sat with her beneath the cottonwoods. There, the ranch looked almost beautiful. The fences ran straight to the horizon, the sky so wide it made my chest ache. I tried to imagine a life somewhere beyond that sky, a place where my daughter would not inherit my shame. But imagining it did not make it real. It was on one of those afternoons that a rider appeared on the far side of the pasture. I watched as the horse moved slowly closer, the figure atop it unfamiliar. When he reached the gate, he dismounted and tied the reins with the ease of someone accustomed to long journeys. He carried a leather satchel over his shoulder and wore a dark coat despite the heat. I stood, lifting Lucy into my arms, and waited by the fence. When he drew nearer, I could see that he was older than I first thought, with gray in his beard and eyes that seemed too tired for a stranger. He introduced himself as Samuel Hale. His voice was low and measured, the voice of a man who spent more time thinking than speaking. He explained that he was the attorney responsible for finalizing Thomas's affairs and ensuring the will would be carried out without dispute. I nodded, though I didn't know what he expected from me. He looked past me toward the house, then back at Lucy, who clung to my shoulder with wide eyes. He asked if I was receiving what I needed, if I felt safe here. The question startled me so much I nearly stepped back. No one had ever asked me that, not in all the years I'd been in that place. My throat felt tight, but I managed to say that I had all I required. He studied my face a moment longer, as if he could see past the polite answer, but he didn't press me. Before he left, he handed me a folded paper. He said it was a letter of reference, should I ever wish to seek work elsewhere. He explained that it carried Thomas's signature and would be recognized by any household or business in the county. My hands trembled as I took it. It felt heavier than paper ought to feel, as if it carried not only words but all the unspoken finalities between us. After he rode away, I stood by the fence, the letter pressed against my chest. The wind moved through the grass in soft waves. For the first time, I felt the truth settle into me. This place was not my home, and it never had been. Whatever scraps of belonging I had clung to were as fragile as a spider's web. One sharp wind, and it would all blow apart. That night, as I rocked Lucy to sleep, I thought about the road that would carry us away from this ranch. I pictured towns I had never seen, streets with strangers who would not know my name or my story. The thought frightened me, but it also kindled a small, steady hope. I did not know where we would go, but I knew we would go together, and that would have to be enough. In the days after Mr. Hale's visit, the house seemed to hold its breath. Thomas spent more hours lying in the front room, a blanket pulled over his legs even when the afternoons were warm. He no longer barked orders or paced the porch. Instead, he watched the doorway as though waiting for something or someone to appear and deliver him from the hollow he had carved into his own life. I sometimes wondered if he regretted the way he had chosen to spend his years, but he never spoke of it, and I did not dare ask. Miriam grew restless as the summer ripened. She oversaw the accounts and gave instructions to the men who managed the herd, her voice clipped and impatient. She stopped acknowledging me unless she had a task to assign. Once, when she handed me a list of supplies to fetch from town, her fingers brushed mine, and she pulled back as though my skin burned. That small recoil lodged itself in my memory more deeply than any insult she had ever thrown. I took Lucy with me when I went to town. I did not trust leaving her behind, not even for a few hours. I carried her on my hip, her cheek pressed to my collarbone, while I moved among the narrow aisles of the store. The shopkeeper was a short, round woman named Mrs. Barlow, who always spoke in a soft tone that made me uneasy, as if she were pitying me even while she counted my change. On that trip, as I waited for the clerk to wrap flour and lye soap, Mrs. Barlow stepped closer. She looked at Lucy for a long moment, then at me. She asked if I had made plans for the future now that the old man's health was failing. Her voice was careful, but the curiosity behind it was too sharp to disguise. I told her I was still considering my options. She nodded as if she approved, but her eyes flicked to Lucy again. She said it was good to think ahead, that there was no kindness in staying where you were not wanted. Her words followed me back to the ranch, clinging to my thoughts even as I set the supplies in the kitchen. I could feel how the walls were inching closer around me, the days counting down in a ledger I was not allowed to see. That evening, I sat outside with Lucy while the last of the sun slipped behind the trees. The air smelled of warm earth and the faint sweetness of clover. For a few minutes, I closed my eyes and let myself believe there was still time, that the world beyond the gate might be gentler than the one I had known. But the next morning brought a sharp reminder that my place was already being measured. Miriam called me into the parlor, her face set in that composed mask she wore when she meant to be cruel without raising her voice. She told me that Thomas's condition had worsened overnight. The doctor had come before dawn and said it could be a matter of weeks, maybe less. She did not look at me when she said it. Instead, she studied the carpet, her thumb brushing the edge of her sleeve in small, controlled motions. I waited for her to continue, my pulse loud in my ears. Finally, she lifted her chin and said she expected I would begin gathering my things. There was no accusation in her tone, no anger, only a cold courtesy that hurt more than any shouting would have. She added that once the will was read, there would be no reason for me to remain. I nodded because I knew any protest would be wasted. In that moment, I felt something inside me go quiet. Not in defeat, but in a clarity I had not known before. I understood that no matter how hard I had worked, no matter how many nights I had lain awake listening for Lucy's breathing, I would never be more to them than a temporary obligation. That afternoon, I went to the small room where I slept and began folding what little I owned. A few dresses worn thin by years of scrubbing, a wool shawl, the carved hair comb my mother had given me. I packed them into a canvas bag and set it by the door. Lucy watched from her blanket, her eyes following my every movement. I tried to smile at her, but the expression felt brittle on my face. Later, when the house had gone quiet, I sat with Thomas. He did not wake when I entered. His breathing was shallow, his hands resting on the coverlet as though he had simply drifted into a sleep from which he would not return. For a while, I watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, remembering the first night he had brought me here, the way I had trembled in the dark, too young to understand the shape my life was taking. I thought about telling him that I forgave him, but the words would not form. Perhaps forgiveness was too large a thing to give, or perhaps it was something neither of us deserved. In the end, I left the room without speaking, closing the door with care so the latch would not rattle. In the days that followed, I carried on as if nothing had changed. I fed the hens, swept the porch, washed the linens. Each small task steadied me, giving my hands purpose even as my heart felt as thin as paper. In the evenings, I read to Lucy from a tattered book of folk tales. She liked the story about the woman who turned into a wild goose and flew away from her captors. Sometimes, as I read those lines, I wondered what it would feel like to have wings, to rise above the pasture fences and disappear into the sky without looking back. On the last day of the week, a wagon arrived, carrying more crates than I had ever seen at once. Miriam supervised as men unloaded them, her instructions brisk and efficient. I stood in the doorway with Lucy, watching the boxes stack higher and higher. It struck me that these were the symbols of a life continuing without me, a household preparing to shed its unwanted skin, and I understood, with a calm I did not expect, that my time here was no longer measured in days but in hours. That evening, when the wagon had rolled away and the dust had settled over the yard, I sat on the back step with Lucy in my lap. The sky was turning the soft blue of early twilight, and a single star blinked in the east. I traced the outline of her tiny hand against my palm, and felt an ache I couldn't name. It was more than sadness. It was the quiet certainty that soon I would walk away from this place with no promise of where we would land. Inside, Miriam's voice carried in low, steady commands as she instructed the hired men on where to store the crates. Her words drifted through the open window like a reminder that this was no longer a home but a ledger being balanced. Every shelf and cupboard was claimed, every corner accounted for. There would be no room left for a woman and her child whose names were never written in any inheritance. When darkness gathered, I brought Lucy into my room and lit the small lamp. The walls looked different in that glow, the shadows longer and more patient. I folded a blanket and laid it near the door, so she would stay warm if the night turned cold. As she drifted to sleep, I smoothed her hair and wondered if she would remember any of this when she was grown. Maybe in some corner of her memory, she would recall the way my arms held her tight even when everything else was slipping away. I did not sleep much. Each hour passed, with the slow scrape of thoughts I couldn't quiet. Near dawn, I finally rose and went outside. The air was sharp with dew, the grass wet under my slippers. For a moment, I let myself stand still and breathe it in. It struck me that this might be the last morning I would see these fields stretching into the distance, the last time I would feel the hush that came before sunrise. Thomas died just after daylight broke. I was in the kitchen preparing porridge when I heard Miriam's footsteps, quicker than usual. She did not speak as she crossed the threshold, only looked at me with eyes I couldn't read. I set the spoon down and wiped my hands. There was nothing to ask. I knew before she opened her mouth that the final hour had arrived. The doctor was called. By mid-morning, word had traveled as it always did in small towns. A few neighbors came by, their faces arranged in solemn masks. I stayed in the kitchen, Lucy balanced on my hip, pretending to measure flour I did not need. Grief sat thick in the rooms, though it was not my grief. Mine had been spent long ago, piece by piece, until only a hollow acceptance remained. When the undertaker came, Miriam followed him into Thomas's room. I did not intrude. I waited by the stove, listening to the muffled movements behind the door. Lucy shifted against me, her small hand clutching the collar of my dress. In that moment, I felt a calm that startled me. The end I had dreaded was here, and instead of fear, I felt relief so clean it almost stung. By afternoon, the parlor was filled with murmured condolences. Neighbors offered casseroles and polite sorrow. No one spoke directly to me except to nod, and I was grateful for their distance. I did not want their pity. I did not want to pretend I had lost something precious when the truth was that I had been losing it a little every day for years. After they left, Miriam called me into the sitting room. Her dress was dark and severe, her hair pinned so tightly it looked painful. She gestured for me to sit, and I obeyed because it seemed easier than refusing. For a long moment, she said nothing, only pressed her lips together as though gathering strength. Finally, she informed me that the will would be read in 2 days. She said it in a tone so flat it might have been about the weather. I nodded, keeping my hands folded in my lap. My heart beat steadily, no faster than before. She continued, explaining that once the arrangements were complete, there would be no reason for me to stay. Her voice held no malice, only a weary finality. She said she wished me no harm. But she also made clear that I was expected to go. There was nothing left to argue. I rose and thanked her for her honesty. She looked surprised, as if she had expected tears or a plea. Instead, I walked past her and into the hall where Lucy waited. I lifted my daughter into my arms and carried her back to the small room that had been ours. That night, I packed the last of my belongings. The small comb, the folded dresses, the single photograph of my mother I had carried from home. I laid each item in the canvas bag with a care I could not explain, as if the simple act of folding fabric might keep my memories from slipping away. When everything was done, I sat on the edge of the bed, Lucy nestled against me. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake in that house, too afraid to dream of anything beyond its walls. Now, with nothing to keep me here, I felt the strange flutter of something that was almost hope. I pressed my lips to Lucy's warm forehead and whispered that soon we would leave. There would be no more watching from doorways, no more waiting to be told whether we were worthy of a place. Whatever waited on the other side of the pasture fence, I would meet it on my own terms. In the silence that followed, I closed my eyes and let the moment settle over me like a promise. I did not know where we were going, but for the first time, I felt certain we would not be coming back. Hi, ChatGPT. 2 mornings later, the sun rose behind a thin veil of clouds that dulled the fields to the color of old linen. I dressed Lucy in her cleanest gown and brushed her hair until it shone like polished copper. She looked up at me with a solemn curiosity, as if she sensed the day was different from all the ones before. When the clock in the hall struck 10, the lawyer returned. Mr. Hale wore the same brown suit, though it seemed more rumpled than I remembered. He greeted Miriam with a nod that was neither warm nor cold, simply the courtesy of a man accustomed to tidying up other people's endings. The reading took place in the parlor. I stood near the doorway with Lucy on my hip, watching as Miriam and 2 of Thomas's nephews settled into the chairs. No one offered me a seat, and I did not expect one. I preferred to remain apart, like an observer in a theater, who knew the script but could not alter a single line. Mr. Hale cleared his throat and opened the leather folio he carried. His voice was steady as he began to recite the provisions of the will. The land went to Miriam, as everyone knew it would. The livestock and the equipment would be divided among the nephews, with instructions to maintain the property's name and legacy. He read these details in a tone stripped of sentiment, and I felt a strange detachment, as if I were hearing about the fate of strangers. When he reached the final clause, he paused. His eyes flicked up to me, then back to the paper. He read that a modest sum had been set aside in trust, to be claimed upon my departure and not before. The money was described in precise terms enough to secure lodgings, enough to buy food for a time, nothing more. Nothing that might be mistaken for affection or regret. A hush settled over the room. Miriam exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath. I felt the weight of all their gazes pressing against my skin, but no one said a word to me, and I found I was grateful for that small mercy. When the reading ended, Mr. Hale folded the paper and closed the folio. He rose to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back. His gaze rested on me, searching for something I could not name. In a voice softer than before, he told me he hoped I would find peace wherever I chose to go. I nodded because I could think of nothing to say. He inclined his head, then stepped into the hallway. The front door closed behind him with a quiet finality that seemed to echo through the house. Miriam stood and smoothed the front of her dress. She did not look at me as she thanked the nephews for coming. They murmured condolences and drifted out one by one, their boots leaving faint traces of dust on the polished floor. When the last of them had gone, the house fell silent in a way I had never heard before. I remained in the doorway, holding Lucy against my heart. Miriam glanced up at me then, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might speak, but she only lifted her chin and walked past me into the kitchen. I listened to the cupboard doors opening and closing, the familiar sounds strangely hollow now that there was nothing left to keep me tethered. That afternoon, I packed the last of our things. I wrapped Lucy's blanket around her shoulders and tied the small bundle of clothes with a length of twine. My hands moved with a steady purpose, and with each folded garment, I felt lighter. It was not joy. It was something quieter and more enduring, the knowledge that I had done all I could here, and that staying any longer would be an injury I could not bear. When the sun slipped behind the ridge, I carried our belongings to the wagon waiting near the fence. The hired man who held the reins did not meet my eyes as I approached. He only nodded and reached down to help me lift the bundle into the back. I turned once more to look at the house. The windows glowed with lamplight, each pane a small square of memory. I thought of the girl I had been when I first crossed that threshold, frightened, untested, so hungry for any scrap of kindness. I thought of the woman I was now, holding my daughter close, knowing the price of survival and the worth of my own spirit. Miriam appeared in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the light behind her. She did not step onto the porch. She simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her. Our eyes met, and in that stillness, I felt a quiet understanding pass between us. We had shared nothing but necessity, yet in this final moment, there was no hatred left, only the exhausted acknowledgement of two lives entangled by a man now gone. I did not raise my hand to wave. I did not expect her to. Instead, I climbed onto the wagon seat and settled Lucy in my lap. As the horse began to move, I kept my gaze forward. The road stretched ahead, rutted and uncertain, but it was mine to follow. The house receded behind us, growing smaller until it disappeared into the darkness. I did not look back again. For the first time in years, I felt the faint stirring of possibility, as if the night itself were breathing alongside me, whispering that I had not yet reached the end of what I could become. The wagon carried us away from the only place I had known as an adult, the creaking wheels marking the slow miles between what had been and whatever waited beyond. The fields fell behind us, their fences and split-rail gates dissolving into the dusk. Lucy shifted against me, half asleep, her head tucked under my chin. I wrapped my arms around her and let the road lull us into a quiet neither of us could name. When dawn began to lighten the hills, the driver stopped beside a crossroads where a wooden sign pointed east to a town called Pine Hollow. He told me this was as far as he had been paid to go. His voice held no judgment, only the matter-of-fact tone of a man accustomed to hauling burdens not his own. I climbed down with Lucy and the bundle of clothes. The air smelled of damp grass and wood smoke drifting from some hidden farmhouse. I watched the wagon roll on until it was no more than a shape among trees. Then I looked down at my daughter, her face pale with sleep, and felt the first stirrings of fear. Not the old fear that someone might take everything from me, but a new, unfamiliar dread that I might have nothing left to give. We walked the remaining mile into town, the dirt road soft underfoot from a recent rain. Pine Hollow was no bigger than the map had promised, a single street lined with clapboard buildings, a church steeple rising like a finger pointing out my smallness. A stray dog trailed us for a while, its ribs showing beneath patchy fur. I might have envied its freedom, if not for the child in my arms reminding me I was never alone, not truly. At the boarding house, a woman named Mrs. Talbot opened the door, her eyes going straight to Lucy before she even greeted me. I explained I was looking for a room and offered the letter Mr. Hale had pressed into my hand. She read it with a frown that softened only when she reached the signature. Then she nodded and stepped aside to let us in. The room she led me to was upstairs, tucked beneath the eaves. It held a narrow bed, a chipped washstand, and a single window overlooking the street. I set our bundle on the floor and stood there for a moment, adjusting to the knowledge that this would be home for a time. The walls were thin enough that I could hear a man coughing in the next room and a baby wailing farther down the hall. Yet in that cramped space, I felt something close to relief. No one here knew who I had been. No one cared. Mrs. Talbot asked if I planned to find work, her voice polite but edged with curiosity. I told her I could sew and cook and clean, that I was willing to do whatever was needed. She seemed satisfied and left us alone, her skirts whispering along the floorboards. I washed Lucy's face in the basin and laid her on the bed. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she too was measuring this new place against all that had come before. I smoothed her hair and whispered that we would be safe here, even if I could not yet believe it myself. Over the next days, I learned the patterns of Pine Hollow. Mornings began with the bell at the church ringing a thin, hopeful note. Children hurried along the boardwalk to the schoolhouse, their laughter echoing between the buildings. I walked with Lucy to the general store, where I bought flour and matches, feeling the gaze of strangers on my back. But no one asked questions I could not answer. I took in mending for the shopkeepers' wives. At night, I stitched by lamplight until my fingers grew numb. Each coin I earned I counted twice before folding it into the cloth pouch beneath my pillow. Some evenings, Mrs. Talbot stopped by with a plate of bread or a small jar of preserves. She never lingered long, but her small gestures softened the edges of my loneliness. One afternoon, as I was carrying water up the stairs, I nearly collided with a man descending. He caught my elbow to steady me, and for a moment, our eyes met. He was younger than Thomas had been, with a lined face that suggested he had seen more years of hardship than of ease. He released my arm quickly and apologized in a voice that sounded unused to gentleness. His name was Robert, I learned later, a widower who worked in the livery stable. People said he had come to Pine Hollow after losing his farm to a fire. I did not expect to see him again, but that evening, when I stepped out to shake the crumbs from a towel, he was crossing the yard. He raised a hand in greeting, then kept walking, as though anything more would have been too bold. That night, I lay awake thinking of the way his eyes had met mine without judgment. It was not affection I felt. It was simply the unexpected comfort of being seen without scorn. I held Lucy close and wondered if a life built from such small recognitions could ever be enough. In the quiet dark, I began to believe it might be. Not because I had found something grand or certain, but because each sunrise brought a chance to begin again. And though I did not know how long we would stay in Pine Hollow, I knew that for the first time, I was not waiting for permission to belong. Hoi chat GPT. Summer pressed itself into every corner of Pine Hollow, filling the air with the smell of warm dust and honeysuckle that climbed the fences behind the boarding house. The heat made the days feel slow and heavy, as if time itself had grown weary. I spent the mornings mending shirts for the mercantile and the afternoons tending to Lucy, who had learned to pull herself upright on unsteady legs. She moved with the fierce determination of someone too young to know caution, her hands reaching for anything that might help her stand a little taller. Each evening, when the last light faded from the rooftops, I sat by the window with my needle and thread. I worked by lamplight, listening to the muffled sounds of the other boarders returning from their own labors. Sometimes, I heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs, the measured rhythm of a man who never expected to be noticed. He would nod if our paths crossed, a brief acknowledgement that never lingered long enough to become obligation. It surprised me how quickly the routines of this place settled around us. The shopkeepers began to greet me by name. Mrs. Talbot trusted me to mind the front desk when she had errands. Even the children, wild with summer energy, would wave as Lucy and I passed by on our way to the pump or the post office. No one asked about the life I had left behind. In their eyes, I was simply Rose, a quiet woman with a baby, and a skill for stitching seams that would not unravel. One afternoon, as I swept the steps, Robert approached carrying a bundle of harness straps. He paused at the bottom stair, clearing his throat before he spoke. He asked if I might look at the leather, which had split along the stitching. His voice was careful, as though he feared he might be imposing. I told him I had never repaired tack before but was willing to try. He thanked me, his gaze flicking to Lucy where she sat on the porch, her small hands exploring the shape of a wooden spoon. When he turned to leave, something in me stirred a brief warmth I had not expected. It was not the quick spark of infatuation I had felt in girlhood. It was quieter, more like the relief of finding a familiar landmark after wandering a long, dark road. That night, after Lucy had drifted to sleep, I examined the leather straps by lamplight. The wear was deep, the fibers cracked in places where they could not be coaxed whole again. As I threaded my needle, I thought about how much easier it was to mend material things than to repair the hidden tears inside a person. Yet something in the work steadied me, reminding me that small acts of care still mattered. A few days later, I brought the harness to the livery stable. Robert looked surprised when I entered, as though he had not truly believed I would come. He took the bundle from my arms and turned it over in his hands, his eyes softening as he examined the stitches. He said I had done better than he expected. I laughed, the sound so unfamiliar that it startled us both. For a moment, we stood in that quiet space, neither of us sure what to say next. Before I left, he offered me a job helping to keep the accounts for the stable. He explained that the books were always a mess, and that he had little patience for numbers. I hesitated, feeling the old uncertainty rise in my chest, but he added that he trusted me to be honest. The simplicity of his faith disarmed me more than any compliment could have. I told him I would consider it. As I walked back to the boarding house, I carried the knowledge of his offer like a small flame cupped in my hands. It felt dangerous to want something again, even something as modest as a purpose beyond survival. But I could not deny that the thought of steady work, of days with shape and meaning, awakened a hope I had buried too long. That evening, I sat by the window with Lucy in my lap. The sky was streaked with the gold and lavender of dusk. She rested her cheek against my shoulder, her breath warm and even. I watched the lamplights bloom along the street and thought about how quickly a place could begin to feel like something close to home. I knew better than to believe in certainty. The past had taught me how swiftly foundations could crumble, but for the first time since leaving the ranch, I did not feel like a woman suspended in someone else's story. Here, in this quiet town, I was beginning to write my own lines, however humble they might be. I pressed my lips to Lucy's hair and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I would tell Robert yes. It was a small decision, but it was mine to make, unclaimed by any ghost or obligation. In that moment, I understood that sometimes the most profound act of courage was not fleeing or fighting, but simply choosing to stay and see what the next day might bring. Morning came with a hush that felt almost like a blessing. The boarding house was still. The other lodgers slow to rise in the summer heat. I dressed Lucy and set her on the patchwork quilt, where she busied herself with a cloth doll Mrs. Talbot had given her. My hands shook just a little as I smoothed my hair and tied my apron. It was such a small thing, agreeing to keep accounts at the stable, yet it felt as though I were stepping into a place I had never dared enter, a life that belonged only to me. I walked the short distance to the livery as the sun cleared the rooftops. The air smelled of fresh hay and the sharp tang of horses. Robert was already at work, hauling a barrel of feed into the corner. He paused when he saw me, brushing a hand over his brow. I thought he might look uncertain or embarrassed, but instead, he gave a nod that felt like a quiet agreement between equals. I told him I would take the job. His relief was visible in the way his shoulders dropped. He led me to a small office at the back of the stable, a space crowded with ledgers and dull pencils worn to nubs. Papers were stacked in teetering piles, some yellowed at the edges. I felt a smile tug at my mouth, despite the clutter. It was clear he had managed as best he could, and that he was proud of what he had built, even if the books were in disarray. He explained the system he used, such as it was, pointing out receipts pinned to a board and payments logged in a ledger thick with corrections. I listened carefully, committing each detail to memory. When he finished, he looked at me with an expression I recognized from my own reflection, a mix of hope and caution, as though he feared the smallest disappointment might undo everything he was trying to hold together. I assured him I would bring order to the records. He nodded again, his mouth pulling into something that was almost a smile. Then he left me alone to begin. The work suited me in ways I hadn't expected. There was comfort in numbers and lists, in the quiet certainty that figures could be set in neat rows and balanced. I traced each column with the tip of my pencil, feeling as if I were slowly stitching together a fabric that had frayed under too many careless hands. Every tally I recorded felt like a small act of reclaiming something I'd long been denied. When I looked up from the ledgers, the day had slipped by almost unnoticed. Robert stepped into the doorway, wiping his palms on his trousers. He asked if I planned to return tomorrow. I said I would, and meant it. He inclined his head, and I gathered Lucy in my arms to walk back through town. The streets were busier in the afternoon, filled with the hum of ordinary business. A woman called to her son, as he darted past with a bundle of kindling. Two men unloaded crates from a wagon while the grocer shouted directions. No one looked twice at me. I moved among them as if I had always belonged, and for the first time in years, I felt the tightness in my chesties. That evening, after Lucy had eaten and drifted into sleep, I sat by the window with the lamplight pooling around my feet. I thought about the day, about the way Robert's eyes had softened when I promised to return. It would have been easy to mistake that softness for something more, but I knew better than to weave illusions from kindness. Still, I could not deny that his trust had given me something steady to hold to. Mrs. Talbot tapped lightly at the door before she came in, carrying a bowl of ripe strawberries. She set them on the table and asked how I was settling. I told her about the work, about the relief of feeling useful again. She nodded, her gaze lingering on Lucy where she slept with her hand curled beneath her cheek. Then she said something I would remember long after she left the room. She said that starting over was never about forgetting, but about deciding that what came next mattered more than what had been lost. When she closed the door behind her, I sat for a long while, turning her words over in my mind. I had spent so many years measuring my life by the weight of old wounds. I had let the past define the limits of what I thought possible. But as I looked at Lucy in the quiet room that had begun to feel like a refuge, I wondered if there was more waiting for me than I dared imagine. Outside, the night deepened until only a thin sliver of moon remained. I listened to the sound of distant wagon wheels on the road, the hush of leaves stirring in the darkness. I pressed my palm to the window pane, feeling the cool glass under my skin. For the first time, I allowed myself to think that maybe I was no longer merely surviving. Maybe, in this small town, with these small steps, I was learning what it meant to live. Hi, ChatGPT. The days unfolded in a quiet rhythm that felt almost like contentment. Each morning, I walked to the livery with Lucy bundled against my hip, her cheek warm against my collarbone. Robert was always there before me, already at work among the rows of stalls and the scatter of hay across the floor. He greeted me with the same simple nod, a gesture that had become its own small reassurance. I kept the accounts as promised, each page gradually transforming from chaos to order. The ledgers grew neater, their columns precise. It pleased me more than I expected, this proof that my efforts mattered, that my hands could bring some measure of steadiness to a place that needed it. When the work was done, I sometimes stayed a while longer, letting Lucy toddle near the open doorway while I helped with small tasks, mending a torn feed sack, sweeping stray grain into neat piles. Robert never asked about my past. If he wondered, he kept it to himself. Instead, he spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the condition of the horses, the repairs he hoped to make before winter returned. There was something comforting in those plain words. They asked nothing of me but my presence. They made no demands I wasn't ready to answer. One afternoon, as we worked side by side repairing a harness, he paused to watch Lucy where she sat in a patch of sunlight playing with a length of frayed rope. His face softened in a way that made something shift inside me, some old ache I had nearly forgotten. He said she was a strong little girl. I swallowed the sudden tightness in my throat and agreed. It was the first time in years I had heard someone say anything kind about my child without a trace of pity. Later, when the shadows had lengthened across the yard, I gathered Lucy to leave. Robert walked us to the edge of the porch. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed me a small tin of salve. He said it might help the cracks in my hands from all the stitching and scrubbing. His voice was awkward, almost shy. I thanked him and slipped it into my apron, feeling the weight of the gesture more than the object itself. That evening, I sat by the window, rubbing the salve into the raw skin of my knuckles. The faint scent of lavender rose into the stillness. It felt like something I did not dare name, a kind of caring I had never expected to find again. I closed my eyes and let the softness of it rest there, unclaimed and unhurried. Summer tipped into early autumn. The leaves along the main road turned brittle at the edges, touched with the first hints of gold. I felt it in the air, a change as certain as the closing of a door. My time in Pine Hollow had started as a pause, a necessary refuge, but each passing day rooted me more firmly to its dusty streets and the people who had quietly begun to matter. One morning, Mrs. Talbot mentioned that a small cottage behind the church would soon be vacant. The widow who lived there planned to move south to be near her daughter. As she spoke, she studied me in that measured way of hers, as though she was weighing what I could bear. She said the rent would be modest and that Lucy would have space to play in the yard. I thanked her, though my heart fluttered at the thought. It was one thing to occupy a borrowed room, it was something else to claim a place as mine, to risk believing I had earned the right to stay. That night, I lay awake long after Lucy had drifted into sleep. The idea of a home that belonged to us felt too large to hold. But beneath the doubt, something steady began to take root, a wish I could not quite deny. The next afternoon, I walked to the stable to tell Robert about the cottage. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady. When I finished, he said he thought it was a fine idea. His approval settled over me like a balm I hadn't known I needed. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he would help me move what little I owned. I thanked him, trying to keep my voice from wavering. He only nodded, but when I turned to leave, he touched my arm lightly, a brief, steadying pressure that lingered after I stepped into the sunlight. In the days that followed, I packed our things into neat bundles. Mrs. Talbot gave me a set of worn curtains she no longer needed. She said every home deserved a bit of softness. I folded them carefully, imagining them fluttering in the kitchen window, proof that this new life was real and not some fragile dream. On the morning of the move, Robert arrived with a borrowed cart. He lifted the bundles with an ease that made me remember, all at once, how tired I had been carrying so much alone. Lucy clapped her hands as he set the last parcel in place. I felt a sudden, quiet gladness that she would not remember the years before Pine Hollow, the years when kindness had felt like a language I no longer spoke. When everything was loaded, I stood in the doorway of my small room one final time. I let my gaze rest on the faded quilt, the washstand, the lamp that had lit so many evenings of careful mending. Then I closed the door behind me. We rode through town in the pale light of early day. The streets were nearly empty, the shop signs still dark. It felt as though the world itself was pausing to witness this small act of beginning. I kept one hand on Lucy's shoulder and the other pressed flat over my heart, steadying its hopeful tremor. As the cart turned the corner toward the church, I thought of all the roads that had carried me here, every mile laid down by choices I had never truly made. For the first time, I felt as if I had stepped onto a path that was mine alone, waiting for me to decide where it would lead. The cottage behind the church was smaller than I had pictured, its clapboard walls weathered to the color of driftwood. A narrow path wound from the front step to a gate that opened onto the lane. Someone had planted lilac bushes years before, and though most were dry with the season's end, a few green leaves clung stubbornly to the branches. As Robert helped me carry the bundles inside, I kept catching my breath at the thought that this place, worn as it was, belonged to Lucy and me. The rooms were simple. A kitchen no larger than the space I had once slept in, a small parlor with a window looking onto the yard, and a bedroom where I set Lucy's cradle in the corner. There was a thin rug over the plank floor, and when I pressed my palm to it, dust rose in a soft cloud. I did not mind. The emptiness felt like possibility rather than lack. Robert set the last parcel by the hearth and straightened. He looked around, as if seeing the place through my eyes, and said it would suit us well. His voice held no uncertainty. It was the quiet tone he used when he was sure of something. I found that I trusted his certainty more than I trusted my own. After he left, I stood alone in the doorway. For a moment, I felt the old instinct to look over my shoulder, to check if someone would appear to tell me I had no right to be here. But no voice came. The only sound was Lucy's laughter as she crawled across the rug, discovering the way her hands left small prints in the dust. That evening, I lit the lamp and unpacked our few things. I hung the curtains Mrs. Talbot had given me and watched them sway in the breeze that slipped through the cracked window pane. When I set the dented kettle on the stove, I was struck by how the simple act made the space feel like it was already shaping itself around our lives. Lucy fell asleep quickly, her face flushed from the excitement of the day. I sat by her cradle, tracing the curve of her cheek with my thumb. In the soft glow of the lamp, I let myself believe, if only for that hour, that all the endings behind me had led to this quiet beginning. In the mornings, I walked to the stable to keep the books, leaving Lucy in the care of Mrs. Talbot. Each afternoon, I returned to the cottage to find her waiting by the gate, her arms lifted, her eyes bright with trust. I never tired of that sight, never stopped feeling the wonder that I was the one she reached for. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing us together. They greeted me by name, asked after Lucy's health, offered small kindnesses I had not expected. The grocer slipped an extra apple into my basket. The preacher's wife stopped me on the street to say she admired how cheerful my daughter was. These gestures did not erase what had come before, but they stitched a gentler fabric over the places where I had once been torn. As autumn deepened, the trees along the lane flared into red and gold. On Sundays, I sometimes stood by the fence to listen to the hymns drifting from the church. The melodies were unfamiliar, but the voices blended in a way that quieted my mind. I never stepped inside. It felt too much like tempting fate to claim a place in the pews. Still, each week I lingered a little longer, drawn by the sound of hope made into song. One evening, after I finished tallying the week's receipts, Robert walked me to the gate. The sky was turning a soft violet, the first stars appearing like shy lanterns. He asked if I was settling in. I told him the truth, that I felt like I had stepped into someone else's life, and that it frightened me how much I wanted to keep it. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked past me to where Lucy was sitting in the grass, her small hands weaving clover stems together. Finally, he said that sometimes the life that waits for us is the one we would never have chosen, but that does not make it less ours to claim. His words caught something deep in my chest, a place I had thought was closed for good. Before he left, he handed me a wrapped parcel bread still warm from the oven. He said it was nothing, just a gift to mark the new home. But when I took it in my hands, I felt the weight of all the unspoken care that lived beneath his quietness. That night, after Lucy had been fed and the dishes washed, I sat by the window with the parcel on my lap. I did not unwrap it right away. I simply held it there, feeling how solid and real it was. For so long, I had believed that nothing given without condition would last, but perhaps I had been wrong. Perhaps small kindnesses, freely offered, were the most enduring gifts of all. Outside, the first frost of the season settled over the yard, turning each blade of grass to silver. I pressed my palm to the cold glass and watched the night unfold. For the first time, I did not feel like a woman who had arrived at the edge of her story. I felt like someone standing at the threshold, ready to step inside. By the time winter settled fully over Pine Hollow, the cottage had become something more than shelter. The walls still bore the marks of years I hadn't lived, the floorboards still creaked in the same soft complaints, but each day added another layer of belonging. I woke before dawn to light the stove, listening to the hush of snow drifting against the window panes. Lucy slept longer in the colder months, her small body curled into the quilt like a kitten. Sometimes, I watched her breathing in the lamplight, marveling that she had come through so much and still met the world with such open trust. Work at the stable slowed as the roads turned slick and treacherous. Robert hired fewer hands, relying instead on a small circle of men he trusted. I continued to keep the accounts, though the ledgers were leaner, the transactions spaced out by stretches of quiet. On the coldest days, he insisted I stay home rather than risk the walk. When I protested, he only said there was no sense inviting hardship when it could be avoided. I tried not to read too much into the care he showed. I reminded myself that decency was not the same as affection. But there were moments when he met my eyes across the stable, or when his voice softened as he spoke my name, that made my heart stir in ways I had not allowed it to in a long time. Lucy grew stronger by the week. She learned to say simple words, her voice bright as morning. She called me Mama in a tone that still startled me, as if she were reminding me who I had become. She greeted Robert with the same shy wave every time she saw him, her small hand fluttering in the cold air. He always paused to wave back, no matter how busy he was. On one afternoon when the clouds hung low and heavy, I heard a knock at the door. Mrs. Talbot stood on the step, bundled in her shawl. She held out a jar of preserved peaches, saying she thought Lucy might enjoy a taste of summer when the nights grew long. I invited her in, and she accepted with a grateful sigh, stamping the snow from her boots. We sat together in the small kitchen, our hands wrapped around cups of tea. She asked gently how I was finding the cottage, whether the roof had held up against the first hard snow. I told her it was better than I had ever hoped, that every morning felt like a small mercy. She nodded, her eyes kind, but searching. After a pause, she said she had heard folks speaking well of me, that it was no small thing to make a place for oneself after such hardship. Her words warmed something inside me I hadn't realized was still cold. I thanked her, though my voice shook. She only reached across the table to lay her hand over mine, a simple gesture that made me feel, for a moment, like someone worthy of friendship. After she left, I carried Lucy to the window and held her so she could see the snow falling in lazy drifts. She pressed her palm to the glass, her breath making small clouds. Watching her wonder, I felt the weight of the past ease, just enough to allow in the thought that perhaps the worst of it truly was behind us. That evening, Robert stopped by with a basket of split firewood. He set it by the stove without ceremony, brushing the snow from his coat. I thanked him, my hands knotted in the folds of my skirt. He started to say something, then paused. In the quiet, the sound of Lucy humming to herself in the next room seemed to fill every corner of the cottage. At last, he met my gaze. He said he knew I had no cause to trust men, that my history had given me little reason to expect goodness from them. His voice was steady but low, as if he were confessing something that cost him to admit. He added that he would never ask more of me than I was willing to offer, that he was content simply to be someone I could rely on. I felt my throat close around a reply. No words came that could match the simplicity of his honesty. Instead, I only nodded, hoping he could read in my eyes what my voice could not carry. After he left, I stood by the door, feeling the echo of his presence. I realized I was no longer afraid of the quiet that followed. It felt different than the silences I had known before, those thick with judgment or disappointment. This was a gentler stillness, the kind that asked nothing but patience. I banked the fire and carried Lucy to bed. As I settled her under the quilt, she stirred and reached for my hand. Her small fingers wrapped around mine, warm and certain. I thought of all the nights I had lain awake in houses where I did not belong, all the mornings I had risen with nothing to look toward but endurance. Here, in this unassuming place, I had discovered something I never expected, the slow, steady miracle of enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall. I watched it gather on the sill, each flake soft as a promise. And though I did not know what would come when winter melted into spring, I felt no need to borrow trouble from the days ahead. For once, the moment I was living was enough. And for the first time in years, I let myself rest in it, unafraid. Winter crept deeper into the valley, pressing its chill into every crack and seam of the cottage. The nights stretched longer than I could remember, their darkness settling over the rooftops like a heavy quilt. Yet even in that hush, there was a steadiness I had never known before, a sense that the walls around us were sturdy enough to keep the past at bay. In the mornings, I rose before the first hint of light. I stoked the stove, listening to the soft pop of the wood catching flame. The warmth spread slowly, thawing the cold that lingered in my hands. Lucy would wake soon after, her hair tousled, her voice bright with questions. She had begun to string her words together, naming everything she could touch. Each new phrase felt like proof that she was growing beyond the shadows that had marked my own beginnings. I measured the days by the small routines that anchored us. The walk to the stable when the roads were clear enough to trust. The afternoons spent mending shirts by the window while Lucy played with her wooden doll. The simple meals shared at the table, where I learned to savor the hush between us as something whole rather than empty. Robert came by often, though never uninvited. He would bring a sack of flour, or a length of rope he insisted I might need come spring. He never stayed long, but each visit left a quiet warmth that lingered after he stepped back into the cold. Once, he brought Lucy a carved horse, its painted eyes bright as a summer morning. She carried it everywhere, her small hand wrapped tight around its neck, as though she knew it was a promise of something she could not yet name. Sometimes, when she had fallen asleep, I sat by the fire and let my mind trace the shape of the life I was building. It was nothing grand, no wealth, no certainty of what the next year might hold. Yet it was more than I had dared imagine in the years when survival was my only ambition. One evening, as the wind keened around the eaves, I heard another knock. Robert stood there, his hat in his hands, his eyes searching mine as if he were gathering the courage to speak. I stepped back to let him in, feeling my pulse steady in a way that surprised me. He set his hat on the table and turned to face me. His expression was solemn but not unkind. He said he did not mean to overstep, but he wanted me to know that if I ever needed more help, more than a sack of flour or a ride to town, I could ask him without shame. His words were unadorned, spoken like a fact rather than a plea. I felt something loosen in my chest, an old knot I had carried so long. I had mistaken it for part of myself. I thanked him, though the word felt too small to hold the feeling behind it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the tick of the clock above the stove and the faint sigh of Lucy stirring in her sleep. Before he left, he paused with his hand on the latch. He said he knew what it was to feel unmoored, to wonder if a life could be pieced together from what was left after the worst had passed. He said he had learned it could, though it never looked the way you thought it would. When the door closed behind him, I stood in the quiet and let his words settle over me. They felt like the first honest permission I had ever been given to hope for more than endurance, to believe that even the most fractured life might be remade. The next day, the snow eased for the first time in weeks. Lucy and I ventured out to the edge of the yard, where the drifts had begun to recede. She clapped her hands at the patches of brown grass that emerged, her laughter bright in the thin winter sunlight. I watched her take unsteady steps toward the lilac bushes, her footprints the first marks of spring against the frozen earth. I thought then of all the places I had left behind, the rooms I had fled, the nights I had survived by reminding myself there was no choice but to endure. And in that moment, standing in the cold with the sun warming my face, I understood that this was something different. This was not mere survival. It was the quiet claiming of a life I had been told I did not deserve. That evening, I laid Lucy in her cradle and sat by the window. The sky was streaked with the last light of day, the bare branches etched in sharp lines against the fading blue. I closed my eyes and listened to my own breathing, steady and unhurried. I did not know what the thaw would bring, whether new hardships waited just beyond the season's turning, but I felt no dread. Whatever came, I would meet it here, in the house I had made into a home. And for the first time, I believed that was enough. The thaw came slowly, as if the earth itself were cautious to trust the change. Each morning, I opened the door to a yard, transformed by degrees, first a few blades of grass, then the glisten of melting drifts, then patches of damp soil that smelled of renewal. Lucy pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the world turn soft again. I understood her wonder. After so many seasons spent waiting for life to relent, it felt almost like a miracle to see it return. I spent my days balancing the familiar tasks with the small adjustments spring demanded. The roof needed patching where the snow had worked loose a shingle. The garden bed behind the cottage had to be cleared of last year's brittle stems. My hands grew raw with the labor, but each ache felt honest in a way I had missed proof that I was building something tangible, not simply enduring. One morning, I returned from the stable to find a note tucked beneath the edge of my doorstep. The handwriting was careful, the letters formed with a deliberation I recognized at once as Robert's. He wrote that he planned to repair the fence behind the cottage, and wondered if I might like his help with the planting once the ground had warmed enough to take seed. I held the note for a long moment before folding it neatly and slipping it into the pocket of my apron. It was a simple offer, but I felt the quiet weight of it, as though he was asking more than he dared name aloud. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, I sat by the table with the note unfolded before me. My thoughts drifted back to the life I had known before Pine Hollow, how every kindness had been bartered, every promise threaded through with expectation. The part of me that had learned to be wary whispered that no man gave his time without wanting something in return. But another part, quieter but no less certain, reminded me that not all gifts carried hidden debts. In the days that followed, I accepted Robert's help. We worked side by side in the softening soil, our hands stained with the dark, clean earth. Lucy toddled between us, her laughter rising whenever she discovered a worm or a stone worth examining. Robert showed me how to mend the sagging posts, his voice patient as he guided my hands to the right place. It was an intimacy so gradual I almost didn't notice its shape. One afternoon, as we rested beneath the lilacs, he spoke without looking at me. He said he had once believed he was finished with hope, that it was a luxury for people who had never lost everything. His thumb traced a line in the dirt between his boots as he said it. Then he lifted his gaze to mine and said that watching me build a life here had reminded him that hope was not always loud or quick. Sometimes it was simply the choice to keep planting, even when the last harvest had been nothing but sorrow. I didn't answer right away. My throat had gone tight, and I could only nod. The air smelled of thawing grass, of all the things waiting beneath the surface to push their way into the light. After he left that day, I sat alone on the porch, Lucy asleep against my shoulder. I watched the sun slip behind the church steeple, its glow turning the window glass to gold. My heart beat steadily, unhurried and clear. Spring gathered strength, filling the evenings with the trilling of frogs and the slow unfurling of new leaves. I began to spend hours in the garden, turning the soil with a care I had never given anything before. Each seed I pressed into the earth felt like a vow, a small declaration that I was done living only in the shadow of what had been taken from me. Lucy grew braver in her exploring. She trailed me through the rows, her small hands brushing the tender shoots. Sometimes she would look up at me, her face bright with a trust so complete it stole my breath. She did not remember the years before this place, the rooms that had held more fear than comfort. For her, this cottage and the narrow garden were the whole of what a home could be. One evening, as I watched her play, I realized that was the greatest gift this place had given Meth a chance to see the world through her unbroken faith. I could not change where we had come from, but I could choose what she would remember. That night, after she was tucked into her bed, I stepped outside and stood in the quiet yard. The stars scattered above me, each one shining with a steady patience I had never thought to envy. I closed my eyes and let the cool air fill my lungs. For so long, I had carried the conviction that my story was written in sorrow, that I was destined to measure each joy by how quickly it might slip away. But here, with my hands raw from planting, and my heart steadier than it had ever been, I allowed myself to believe that something different was possible. Perhaps happiness was not a sudden flood, but the slow rising of water in a dry well. And perhaps, if I kept tending it, if I did not turn away from the risk of hope, it would one day be enough to quench all the years of thirst. Hoi chat go piti. The first green shoots in the garden unfurled almost overnight. One morning, there was nothing but the dark ridges of freshly turned soil. The next, slender leaves reached upward as though they had been waiting for my back to turn to make their appearance. Lucy was the one who noticed them first, her small voice ringing with delight as she pointed at each tender sprout. I crouched beside her, pressing my hand gently to the earth, feeling the living warmth there. It struck me how something so fragile could persist through the hardest winter. Our days took on a rhythm shaped by that little plot of ground. I rose early to water the seedlings before the sun grew harsh. In the afternoons, Lucy trailed behind me with her wooden pail, solemnly collecting the weeds I pulled free. I tried to teach her the names of each plant, though she preferred to make up her own, calling the beans green fingers and the squash sleepy moons. Her imagination was boundless in a way that humbled me. Robert came by often, though never without some purpose to justify his visits. He brought seed packets or scraps of lumber for the fence, or simply stopped to ask how the rows were coming along. His presence had become so woven into the pattern of our days that I no longer startled when I saw his shape crossing the yard. Instead, I felt a quiet reassurance, as though his steady footsteps reminded me that I was no longer living on borrowed kindness. One warm afternoon, he offered to mend the section of gutter that had sagged under the weight of snow. I watched from the garden as he climbed the ladder, his movements sure and unhurried. There was nothing extraordinary in the scene, nothing that would draw the eye of a passer-by. Yet as I stood there with the sun on my shoulders and Lucy humming to herself nearby, I felt an ease I had never known in all the years before. When he climbed down, he wiped his hands on a rag and asked if I might join him for supper the following Sunday. His voice was calm, but his gaze held a question I understood too well. He was not asking only for my company. He was asking if I was ready to step into something neither of us could name without risking it. I hesitated, feeling the old reflex to retreat rise in me. But then, I looked at Lucy, who was watching us with bright, expectant eyes. I thought of the evenings I had spent alone by the stove, of the way my life had grown richer since I stopped believing solitude was the price of safety. I told him I would come. He nodded once, relief flickering across his face so quickly I might have missed it if I hadn't been searching for it. The days that followed passed in a hush of anticipation. Each morning, I found myself thinking of the meal we would share, of the small, quiet threshold it represented. I tried not to build it into something larger than it was. I reminded myself that nothing had been promised, that the past had taught me to be careful with my trust. Yet beneath all my caution, a slender hope took root, a hope that perhaps I was no longer a woman merely passing through her own life. On Sunday afternoon, I dressed in my plainest blue dress, the one I had saved for occasions when I wished to look tidy but not conspicuous. Lucy clung to my skirts, her excitement so bright it made me laugh in spite of my nerves. When we stepped outside, the air was warm and soft with the promise of late spring. Robert's house stood at the edge of town, a modest place with a wide porch and an orchard that sloped gently toward the river. He met us at the gate, his expression solemn but welcoming. He led us inside, where the table was already set with simple duchessa roast chicken, a loaf of brown bread, a bowl of stewed apples. The scent filled the small kitchen, rich and comforting. Lucy clambered into a chair, her eyes wide with wonder at the spread before her. Robert poured us each a glass of cider, and lifted his cup in a quiet toast. "To new seasons," he said simply. The words struck me more deeply than I expected. They carried no promise, no declaration. Only the acknowledgement that life continued to unfold, one small choice at a time. We ate without hurry, the conversation meandering through the safe terrain of gardens and weather. Now and then, our eyes would meet, and something unspoken passed between us, a fragile understanding that whatever might come next would be shaped by patience rather than demand. After supper, he walked us home. The sky had deepened into a soft purple, the first stars winking to life overhead. At the gate, he paused, his hand resting on the latch. I waited, my breath held in that long, suspended moment. But he did not reach for me or press any claim. He only wished us a good night, his voice as steady as it had been that first morning I came to keep the books. I watched him turn back toward his house, his figure slowly dissolving into the twilight. When I lifted Lucy into my arms, she laid her head against my shoulder, already drifting toward sleep. As I carried her inside, I felt the hush of evening wrap around us like a promise I did not need to speak aloud to believe. In that quiet, I knew something had shifted, not in any grand or sudden way, but in the slow, certain turning of my heart toward the life I had once thought impossible. And as I settled Lucy into her bed and sat alone in the lamplight, I allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to keep saying yes. The morning after that quiet supper, the world looked unchanged. The garden lay in early light, the soil still damp from the night's dew. A few finches trilled in the lilac branches. The boards of the porch were warm beneath my bare feet. Yet beneath that familiar hush, I felt the subtle shift that comes when something has been decided, even if no words were spoken to name it. I went about the chores with a steadiness that surprised me. I swept the kitchen floor, measured flour for bread, and mended the small tear in Lucy's dress where it had caught on the fence. Each task anchored me to the present, reminding me that life was not built from grand moments alone, but from the accumulation of ordinary hours. When I walked to the stable later that day, Robert was in the yard splitting kindling. He straightened when he saw me, brushing wood dust from his hands. Neither of us spoke right away. There was no need. The meal we had shared, the gentle way he had walked us home, had already laid a foundation more real than any declaration could have. He asked if the supper had suited us. I told him it had been more welcome than he knew. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and for a moment, we stood there in the quiet, two people learning how to trust the simplicity of what was unfolding. The days lengthened into early summer. The garden grew thick with green beans climbing their poles, blossoms forming on the squash vines. Lucy grew restless indoors, her small feet carrying her farther each time she ventured beyond the gate. I watched her from the kitchen window, her copper hair bright in the sun, and felt a gratitude so fierce it nearly brought me to my knees. She would not remember the cold rooms of the ranch, or the years I had spent believing my worth began and ended with what someone else might take from me. Here, her memories would be filled with soil and sunlight, with the sound of my voice calling her home. One afternoon, as I gathered laundry from the line, Mrs. Talbot appeared at the fence. She leaned her elbows on the gate, her face framed by the flowering lilacs. She said she had noticed how often Robert came by, her voice gentle rather than prying. I felt my cheeks warm but did not look away. I told her the truth that I didn't know what might come of it, only that it felt honest in a way nothing else ever had. She nodded, her eyes kind. She said that sometimes a woman didn't need to know every step of the path before she set her foot upon it. She had been married nearly 30 years, she reminded me, and still woke some mornings surprised by the comfort she found in the man she had chosen. Her words lingered with me long after she left. That evening, as I sat on the porch watching dusk gather, I thought of how many nights I had spent fearing that any attachment would become a shackle. But nothing about Robert's presence felt like confinement. It was simply a space where I could rest without apology. One night not long after, there was a knock at the door just after Lucy had drifted to sleep. When I opened it, Robert stood there holding a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He said he had been thinning his orchard, and thought we might like some of the apples before they turned. I took the parcel, feeling the solid weight of it in my arms. We did not speak much. He looked past me into the quiet room, at the soft glow of the lamp and the small toys scattered near the hearth. For a moment, he seemed about to say something more. But instead, he reached out and laid his hand over mine where it rested on the doorframe. His touch was steady, warm, asking nothing. When he left, I closed the door with my heart unsteady in my chest. I set the apples on the table and stood for a long moment, breathing in the sweet scent that rose from the bundle. I did not need to unwrap them to understand what the offering meant. It was not an obligation. It was not a debt. It was simply the shape of care, given freely. The next morning, Lucy and I peeled the fruit together. Her small fingers grew sticky with juice, her giggles rising like music in the kitchen. I thought of how different my life had become, how each day brought another proof that I was no longer the woman who had fled with nothing but a child in her arms. By evening, I set jars of preserved apples in a neat row on the shelf. I felt the satisfaction of small accomplishments, of a life quietly built from the gentlest intentions. And when I blew out the lamp, I paused to look back at the tidy kitchen, at the small bed where Lucy slept, at the door where Robert had stood. It struck me that I was no longer waiting for the past to reclaim me. I was living in the middle of something new, something I had chosen, step by careful step. And as I climbed into bed and drew the quilt over my shoulders, I let that understanding fill the last hollow spaces inside me. For the first time, I did not fall asleep with questions circling in my mind. I knew nothing of the future except that I would meet it here, with my heart open to what it might bring. Summer deepened until each day seemed to shimmer with heat. The mornings began early, with the sun climbing the sky before I had finished tending the garden. By noon, the cottage felt heavy with warmth, the air thick enough to slow every movement. I kept the shutters drawn to hold in what little coolness remained, but even so, the rooms turned close and drowsy. Lucy spent the afternoons napping on a quilt near the window, her hair curling damply against her cheeks. In the long hours between chores, I sometimes caught myself thinking about the winters I had survived, when every morning felt like a test of how much more I could bear. Those memories returned less often now, their sharp edges worn smooth by the gentler routines that had replaced them. When they did come, they no longer had the power to unseat me. I could hold them in my mind without flinching, the way you might study an old scar proof not only of the hurt but of the healing that followed. One evening, Robert came to the gate just as the last light was slipping behind the trees. He stood with his hat in his hands, the brim turning slowly between his fingers. When I stepped onto the porch, he looked up, his face solemn in the twilight. He said there was something he'd been wanting to ask but had waited until it felt right. I felt my heart catch, not in fear but in a quiet wonder at how far we had come. He took a breath, then asked if Lucy and I would join him at the harvest gathering the church held every year. His voice was steady, but I could hear the hope beneath it. He explained that there would be music and a long table set with pies and roast meats, that it might be good for Lucy to be among the other children. I nodded before my caution had time to speak. It was not only because I wanted to go, though that was true. It was also because I could feel something in me reaching toward the possibility his invitation offered the chance to step fully into the community I had been living beside for so long. When the evening of the gathering arrived, I dressed Lucy in her best cotton frock and tied a ribbon in her hair. She fidgeted with excitement as I fastened the buttons on my dress, her chatter filling the small kitchen with the bright certainty only a child could possess. I braided my hair and studied my reflection in the glass above the washstand. The woman who looked back at me was not the same one who had arrived in Pine Hollow carrying more sorrow than hope. Her face was still lined by all she had endured, but her eyes were clearer, steadier. Robert came to walk us to the churchyard, where lanterns had been strung between the trees. Their light danced over the tables and the faces of neighbors gathered in small groups, their voices carrying in soft currents of laughter and greeting. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to hang back, to pretend I had only come to watch from the edges. But Lucy tugged my hand, her small feet already hurrying toward the other children, and I let her lead me forward. Mrs. Talbot spotted us and waved us over, her face warm with welcome. She took Lucy's hand and guided her to where a cluster of girls were arranging daisies into crowns. I watched her join them, her shyness dissolving in the shared excitement of their play. Robert stood beside me in the shifting glow of the lanterns. He did not try to fill the silence, did not rush me to speak. Instead, he simply rested his hand lightly on my shoulder, as if to remind me I did not have to stand alone. I turned to him and managed a smile that felt almost as new as it was real. As the evening unfolded, I found myself drawn into conversations I would once have avoided. The preacher's wife asked about my garden, and I described the rows of squash and beans without apology for my pride. One of the shopkeepers pressed a slice of pie into my hand, insisting I looked in need of something sweet. Each kindness settled into me like a small stone of reassurance, adding weight to the fragile sense of belonging I was still learning to trust. When the fiddlers began to play, Robert asked if I would walk with him along the edge of the field. The music followed us, a bright thread of sound that made the night feel gentler than any I could remember. We did not speak much as we walked. It was enough simply to be there, side by side, with no reason to hide from the gaze of others. At the far edge of the field, where the grass grew tall, he stopped. In the hush between songs, he turned toward me. He did not reach for my hand or press me with words. He only looked at me with that quiet steadiness that had become the thing I trusted most, and in that space, I understood that no declaration was needed. What was growing between us was slow and certain, rooted in the simple fact that we had both chosen to remain when leaving would have been easier. When we returned to the churchyard, Lucy was asleep on Mrs. Talbot's lap, her daisy crown slipping over one ear. I gathered her into my arms, her weight a warm and familiar anchor. As we walked home through the darkness, I felt something in me settle into place, not as a promise of what the future must be, but as a quiet acceptance that I no longer had to face it alone. That night, as I laid Lucy in her bed and folded the borrowed quilt over her shoulders, I thought of how many evenings I had ended with my heart braced against disappointment. But here, in this small house I had made my own, I felt only the slow, steady certainty of enough. And as I watched the lamplight fade across the walls, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this was all the belonging I had ever needed. The morning after the harvest gathering dawned clear and bright, the air carrying the first cool breath of autumn. I rose early, while the yard still held a trace of night's chill, and stepped outside to breathe in the quiet. The memory of the lanterns strung through the trees still glowed in me, warm and fragile as a coal I wasn't ready to let die out. Lucy slept longer than usual, her small body spent from the excitement. I let her rest while I swept the porch and set a pot of water to boil. As the kitchen filled with the familiar scent of tea, I thought of the way Robert's hand had rested on my shoulder, light as a promise. It surprised me how easily I recalled the feeling without the old unease, as if something in me had decided at last that there was no harm in being cared for. By the time Lucy stirred, the sun had lifted over the rooftops, gilding the tops of the lilac bushes. She clambered into my lap, still warm with sleep, and asked if the party would happen again that night. I kissed her hair and told her no, but that there would be other gatherings. She frowned as though she found this unfair, then rested her head under my chin, her disappointment already softening into acceptance. The day passed with the quiet of any other. I carried the laundry to the line and watched the sheets billow like pale sails. Lucy played in the garden, her doll tucked carefully in the crook of one arm. Now and then she looked up to be sure I was near. Each time, I lifted my hand in a small wave, and she returned it, satisfied. It struck me that this was the measure of the life I had begun to build, a handful of small gestures repeated until they became their own language. In the afternoon, I walked to the stable to collect the account book I had left behind. The door stood open to the warm air, the dust motes swirling in the golden light. Robert was inside, mending a length of harness with a concentration that softened the lines of his face. When he looked up and saw me, he set aside his work and rose. I thought he might speak of the night before, but he didn't. Instead, he asked how Lucy had fared with all the excitement. I told him she had fallen asleep with her crown still in her hair. He smiled, and for a moment we stood there in the hush, neither of us feeling the need to fill it with anything more. As I turned to leave, he asked if I might like to walk with him again one evening, when the work was done. His voice was careful, but not uncertain. I felt something loosen in my chest, an easing I hadn't known I still needed. I said yes, my answer as quiet as the question, but no less certain. That night, after Lucy was in bed, I sat by the window and watched the last light drain from the sky. I thought of all the years I had spent believing my story was something that happened to me, that my place in the world was decided by the choices of others. But sitting there in the dark, I understood that every small decision I'd made, the ones that had felt too modest to matter, had led me here, to this cottage, this town, this quiet possibility. Over the next weeks, the season began to shift in earnest. The leaves on the trees behind the church turned gold at the edges, and the evenings arrived earlier. Lucy discovered the pleasure of gathering fallen leaves, bringing them to me with solemn pride as though she had found something precious. I strung them on lengths of twine and hung them over the kitchen window, their colors bright against the soft wood of the walls. Robert continued to stop by, always with some pretext: a bundle of kindling, a tin of nails he thought I might need. Each time, I felt the old reflex to question his motives begin to fade. He never pressed, never presumed. He simply made space beside me, leaving me to decide what would fill it. One Sunday, as we walked the long way home from the stable, he told me he had once planned to leave Pine Hollow for good. After the fire that took his farm, he thought there was nothing left here worth staying for, but he said that sometimes, the place you most want to flee becomes the place that finally makes room for you. His words stayed with me long after we parted at the gate. That evening, I found myself standing in the doorway, looking out across the yard to where the garden lay in twilight. The rows were nearly spent, the vines drooping with the weight of their last fruits. Yet even in their waning, they seemed to me a promise kept, proof that something could grow where nothing had thrived before. Inside, Lucy was humming to herself as she arranged her leaves along the hearth. I watched her, feeling the quiet bloom of a contentment I had never thought would belong to me. It was not the sharp sweetness of new love, or the bright rush of certainty. It was something deeper, slower, of faith that perhaps I had finally stepped beyond the reach of all the old hungers and hurts. When I blew out the lamp that night, the darkness felt gentle instead of threatening. I lay awake for a time, listening to the rhythm of Lucy's breathing and the hush of the wind through the lilacs. For once, I did not wonder what might go wrong. I did not brace for loss. I simply let the stillness hold me, unafraid. And in that quiet, I realized I was no longer waiting to be delivered from my life. I was already living it, day by day, in the only way I knew how: be staying, by tending, by choosing, over and over, to remain. The first frost came in the night, leaving every blade of grass traced in silver. When I stepped outside in the pale dawn, my breath rose in soft clouds, and the world felt hushed, as if it were holding itself still to listen. I stood a long while at the edge of the porch, watching the light gather behind the hills. It struck me that for all the years I had spent fearing what lay ahead, I had never paused to be grateful for what had already arrived. Inside, Lucy was still asleep, her small hand curled beneath her cheek. I sat at the table and traced circles in the thin layer of steam that rose from my cup. I thought of all the times I had imagined a future I could not see, a life that felt too far away to believe in. Yet here it was, unfolding around me in moments so ordinary they almost escaped notice. Later that morning, I walked to the stable to help Robert close up the summer storage. The sky was bright and sharp, the kind of cold that wakes every sense. He was waiting in the yard, sorting lengths of rope and stacking them in neat coils. When he looked up, there was no surprise in his face, only the quiet recognition of someone who had come to count on my presence. We worked side by side without much talk. Now and then, our hands brushed over a length of canvas or the rim of a barrel, and neither of us drew back. It was a small thing, but it felt like the truest measure of how far we had come. Once, I would have flinched from such closeness, unsure what it demanded. Now, I understood it asked nothing except that I trust it. When the last of the gear was stored, we stood in the doorway, looking out at the pale field. The wind stirred the grass in long, quiet waves. Robert cleared his throat and said he would be heading to the next county in a week's time to buy feed for the horses before the snow made the roads impassable. He asked if I would like anything brought back, a bolt of cloth, perhaps, or sugar if the store here ran short. I smiled at the thought of him thinking ahead for me, for Lucy. I told him no, that we had everything we needed. He nodded, but his gaze held mine a moment longer, as if he meant to say more. In the end, he only wished me a safe walk home. On the way back, I noticed how the trees had begun to shed their leaves in earnest. The lane was scattered with gold and copper, the colors so vivid they looked almost painted. Lucy was waiting by the gate when I returned, her face bright with excitement. She held out a single leaf, larger than her hand, and announced it was the most beautiful she had ever seen. I crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. I told her it was a fine thing to notice beauty wherever it showed itself, even if it lasted only a day. She didn't quite understand, but she nodded solemnly as though she did. That afternoon, I laid a quilt in the yard, and we sat together beneath the thinning branches. Lucy arranged her collection of leaves in careful rows while I mended a tear in the hem of her dress. Every so often, she would look up and tell me a story about where each leaf had come from, how one had flown all the way from the mountains, how another had fallen just for her to find. Her voice carried such certainty that I found myself nodding along, grateful for her faith in small miracles. When evening came, I lit the lamp early against the gathering chill. I set a pot of stew to simmer and watched the steam curl toward the ceiling. The scent of onions and thyme filled the cottage, and for a moment, I felt a kind of peace so complete it made my eyes sting. After supper, as I settled Lucy into her bed, she asked if Robert would come by tomorrow. I smoothed the quilt over her and said perhaps he would, though I could not promise it. She seemed satisfied with that, her eyes already drifting closed. I sat there a while after her breathing steadied, listening to the wind move through the eaves. When I finally rose, I found myself pausing at the doorway, looking back into the dim room. There was nothing extraordinary in what I saw: a small bed, a plain chair, a few toys scattered across the floor. Yet it felt to me as if this was what I had been searching for all along, even when I hadn't known how to name it. A place where I could be both safe and needed. A life that asked no more of me than my honest care. I banked the fire and washed the last of the dishes. The night pressed close to the windows, but it did not feel threatening. As I lay in my own bed, the quilt pulled up to my chin, I thought of the road Robert would travel soon, of the way he had looked at me before he turned back to his work. I did not know what he would say when he returned, or what I would say in answer, but for once, I felt no urgency to decide. The time for that would come in its own season. For now, it was enough to know that we were both still here, tending what had grown between us with the same quiet care we gave our work. And in that thought, I found a steadiness deeper than any I had ever known. The day Robert left for the next county, the sky was the pale, washed blue that comes before winter sets its claim. I woke early, unable to rest, and found myself standing at the kitchen window long after the kettle had grown cold. I watched the road that led out of town, half expecting to see his wagon pass by, even though I knew he would have started before dawn. Lucy sensed my restlessness. She asked again and again when Robert would return, her small voice bright with curiosity. I told her it would be only a few days, that the horses needed time to carry the feed home before the first true snow. She accepted my answer with the ease of a child who trusts the world to keep its promises. Still, as the hours unfolded, I felt the quiet settle over the cottage in a way that pressed against my ribs. It wasn't the same loneliness I had once known. This was gentler, but no less keen a reminder that I had grown used to the simple comfort of Robert's presence. His steady voice, the way he always paused at the gate as if to be sure I was truly well. I had not realized how much space those moments had begun to fill. I kept busy to hold the restlessness at bay. I mended linens and swept the floors twice over. I took Lucy to the garden to gather the last of the beans, her mittened hands clumsy but eager. Each small task anchored me to the day, reminding me that life continued whether or not I knew exactly where it was leading. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, I sat by the fire with the ledger I had brought home to balance. My pencil moved steadily across the columns of numbers, though my thoughts drifted to the road Robert was traveling. I imagined him camped beneath the stars, the horses tethered close, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. I wondered if he thought of me in the hush between tasks, if he felt the same quiet expectancy I did. The next morning dawned colder still. Frost etched every windowpane in delicate patterns, and the pump handle outside was slick with ice. I carried water inside in small pails, pausing to warm my hands at the stove. Lucy trailed after me, clutching her new favorite treasure, a small pine cone she had found by the fence. She asked if we could walk to the stable to see if Robert had returned. I told her not yet, though I suspected she would ask again before nightfall. Around midday, Mrs. Talbot stopped by with a basket of biscuits still warm from her oven. She said she had thought I might appreciate the company. I felt my throat tighten at her kindness and stepped aside to let her in. We sat together at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She did not press me with questions. Instead, she spoke of her own early years in Pine Hollow, of the winters when she had wondered if she'd made a mistake settling here. She said she had learned that belonging was something built slowly, over countless small acts of staying. After she left, I felt lighter. It struck me how the simplest gestures, warm bread, an easy silence, could tether me to this place more securely than any promise ever had. As evening drew in, I tucked Lucy into bed and sat for a time in the quiet, listening to the wind rising beyond the walls. Each gust rattled the shutters, but it no longer sounded like something waiting to tear my life apart. It was only weather, passing as all things do. On the third morning, I woke to the hush of fresh snow. A thin layer covered the yard and softened every line of the fences and trees. Lucy clapped her hands in delight when she saw it, her excitement unshadowed by the cold. We bundled ourselves in shawls and stepped outside. The air tasted clean, the sky a pale silver. Each of Lucy's steps left a perfect imprint behind her, a trail I could follow if ever I lost sight of her. While she played, I found myself glancing up the road more often, straining for the sound of hooves. I told myself I was being foolish, that Robert had never said exactly which day he would return, but the truth was, I had begun to understand how much I hoped he would return soon. Just before dusk, I heard the steady crunch of wheels over snow. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped onto the porch. There he was, guiding the wagon up the lane, his shoulders bent into the cold. Relief opened in me so swiftly it made me lightheaded. He drew the team to a stop and climbed down, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, neither of us speaking. Then he smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening in that way I had come to trust. He said the roads had been worse than expected, but he was glad to be home. I realized then that he had called it home without hesitation. And more than any declaration, that simple word lodged itself in my heart, a promise given without ceremony. As he unloaded the wagon, Lucy danced around him, chattering about the snow and the pine cones she had gathered. He listened with the same patience he had always shown her, nodding in all the right places. I stood in the doorway, the cold forgotten, and watched them together. That night, after the lamps were out and the cottage had grown quiet, I lay awake in the dark, feeling something I could not quite name. It was more than contentment, deeper than gratitude. It was the dawning understanding that I had finally arrived in my own life, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged exactly where she was. And as sleep took me, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to meet it with my heart unguarded. Snow settled deeper over the valley in the days that followed, draping every rooftop and fence in a hush that felt almost sacred. Each morning, I lit the stove before dawn, the warmth spreading through the rooms while the sky remained pale and silent. Lucy woke eager to greet the day, her cheeks pink with the cold as she pressed her face to the window to watch the flakes drift down. Robert came by often, sometimes with a sack of oats for the stove or a bundle of firewood tied in twine. He never stayed longer than needed, but each visit carried a quiet steadiness that anchored me more than I dared admit aloud. He would pause on the threshold before he left, as if waiting for something he didn't want to ask outright. I always thanked him, though the words felt too small to contain the gratitude rising in me. One afternoon, when the light was already dimming, though it was barely past 3, he arrived carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it carefully on the table without explanation. When I unwrapped it, I found a spool of blue ribbon, finer than any I'd ever owned. "For Lucy's hair," he said simply, his voice gruff in a way that told me he'd thought long about whether to bring it at all. I stood there with the ribbon in my hand, feeling something tender unfold in my chest. It wasn't the extravagance of the gift that moved me, but the thought behind it that he had imagined a small happiness for my child and wanted to place it gently in our keeping. That night, after Lucy was asleep, I sat by the window with the ribbon draped across my palm. I thought of the life I had once believed I was destined for, one where each day was another trial to endure. How strange it was to find, in the simplest gestures, a quiet that felt more healing than any grand rescue. The days grew shorter still, and the road into town became difficult to travel. I spent long hours inside, the hush of snow pressing close around the walls. Lucy filled the rooms with her chatter, her imagination as bright as ever. She named each drift outside the window, as though it were an old friend, and made up stories about where the snowflakes went when they melted. In the evenings, I read to her by lamplight. When her eyelids finally drooped, I would carry her to bed, brushing the hair from her brow before I turned away. Each night, I felt the same swell of wonder that she was here, safe and thriving, when so much of her early life had been shadowed by things she would never remember. One morning, as I chopped kindling in the yard, I looked up to see Robert coming down the lane. His steps were slower than usual, his shoulders set against the cold. When he reached the gate, he rested his hands on the top rail and stood in silence. For a moment, I thought perhaps something had gone wrong, but when he spoke, his voice was calm. He said he would be away for a few days, called to help a neighbor whose barn roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. I felt the familiar ache of worry rise, but I kept my expression steady. I thanked him for telling me. He nodded and added that he would look forward to returning. The way he said it left no doubt that he meant it. When he turned to leave, Lucy ran to the gate, waving both hands. He paused to crouch beside her, murmuring something I couldn't hear. She grinned and pressed her mittened palm to his cheek in a gesture so guileless it made my throat tighten. After he was gone, the yard felt larger somehow, emptier in a way I could not quite name. That evening, I sat long by the stove after Lucy had gone to bed. I listened to the wind tracing the eaves, remembering the years when any absence had felt like a warning. This time, I did not feel dread, only the keen awareness of how much I had come to value his presence. I wondered if that was how belonging revealed itself, not in grand confessions, but in the simple noticing of absence when someone you trust is away. The next few days passed slowly. I filled the hours with small tasks: mending Lucy's winter coat, sorting the pantry shelves, laying kindling by the stove. Each time I stepped outside to fetch water or brush snow from the porch, I caught myself scanning the road, searching for the shape of a man on foot or the glint of a lantern bobbing in the dusk. On the fourth morning, I woke to the sound of Lucy calling from her bed. She was pointing toward the window, her eyes wide with excitement. I peered out into the white yard and saw Robert's figure approaching, his coat dusted with frost. Relief flooded me, as sudden and bright as the first thaw. I opened the door before he reached the steps. He looked tired but whole, his breath a pale cloud in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he lifted a hand in greeting, and I felt the last of my worry melt into something quieter, something closer to joy. He stepped inside just long enough to warm himself by the stove, his hands held out to the fire. He told me the barn had been repaired, that no animals were lost. As he spoke, I watched the way his face eased in the warmth, the way his shoulders lowered as if he, too, had carried an unseen burden. When he finally rose to leave, he paused in the doorway. His gaze found mine with an unhurried steadiness that made the room feel brighter than any lamp. He said he was glad to be back, and that he hoped I knew he would always return. I held that promise close as I watched him disappear into the gathering dusk. It was not the kind of vow I had once believed I needed: no grand declarations, no fevered assurances. It was simpler, truer, a promise proven by each day he chose to stay. And as I banked the fire and turned toward the quiet rooms of my small house, I felt the truth of it settle into me like a warmth I no longer feared to claim. The weeks that followed slipped by with a quiet steadiness I had never thought to call my own. Winter settled deep around the cottage, laying a hush over the yard so complete that some days it felt as if we were the only souls left in the world. Each morning, I woke before the dawn to build the fire, the familiar rhythm grounding me in a life that no longer felt borrowed or fragile. Lucy grew taller, her legs gaining a new confidence as she ran from one end of the house to the other. She liked to sit by the window and watch the snow fall in drifting sheets. Whenever she saw Robert's figure appear through the trees, she would press her face to the glass, her breath clouding the view. It never failed to make me smile, the way she claimed him as part of her small, bright world, without needing to question whether he belonged there. Robert came often, though never so often that it felt like an obligation. Some days he stayed only long enough to leave a bundle of wood by the door. Other times, he lingered to share a cup of coffee or to mend something I hadn't known was broken. Our conversations were unhurried, the silences between words as easy as any speaking. I had once believed silence was something to be filled or endured. Now, I knew it could be a comfort in itself. A space where nothing had to be proven. One evening near the end of December, he arrived carrying a small wooden box wrapped in burlap. He set it on the table and stepped back as if unsure whether he had done the right thing. When I pulled the cloth aside, I found a row of small glass jars, each filled with preserved strawberry, rhubarb, pear. For the cold months, he said, his voice low. So you and Lucy have something sweet, when the world feels empty. I traced my fingertips over the lids, unable to speak for a moment. It wasn't the gift itself that moved me so much as what it meant that he saw us. Not as a burden or a pity, but as something worth tending. When I finally looked up, he met my gaze without flinching, and in that quiet, I felt something settle between us with the weight of certainty. That night, after he left, I opened the jar of strawberries and spooned a little onto a slice of bread. Lucy's eyes went wide at the taste, her smile bright enough to outshine the lamps. I watched her eat, the sweetness staining her mouth, and felt a warmth spread through me that no winter could touch. In the days that followed, snow began to fall in earnest, drifting in high banks against the side of the house. Each morning, I shoveled a path to the woodpile and knocked the ice from the pump. My hands grew chapped and red, but the work felt honest, the ache in my arms a reminder that I was no longer living at the mercy of someone else's temper. Every small task was my own choice, every hardship softened by the knowledge that I had claimed this life piece by piece. One afternoon, as I sat mending a tear in Lucy's sleeve, I heard a knock that was softer than usual. When I opened the door, Robert stood there, his cap in his hands, snow clinging to his coat. He didn't step inside right away. Instead, he looked past me, as if gathering the courage for something he could no longer keep silent. He said he had been thinking, all through the long evenings, about what it might mean if he asked to share more of our days. His voice was steady but careful, the way a man speaks when he knows the weight of his own words. He didn't ask outright, not then, but the question lived plainly in the space between us. I felt my heart rise into my throat, not with fear but with a tenderness so keen it almost hurt. For a moment, I thought of all the years I had spent bracing for the worst, all the times I had believed love was only another name for surrender. And yet, standing there in the doorway, I understood how much had changed. I told him he was welcome to come back the next evening, so we might talk without the cold at our backs. Relief flickered across his face, though he didn't smile. Instead, he nodded, the smallest gesture carrying all the promise I needed. That night, after Lucy was asleep, I sat by the fire with my hands folded in my lap. I did not try to plan what I would say when he returned. I only let myself feel the quiet certainty that whatever words came, they would be honest. For the first time, I did not doubt that honesty could be enough. Outside, the snow fell steady and unhurried. I watched it gather along the windowsill, softening the sharp edges of the world. In that hush, I felt the truth I had spent so long running from, that love did not always come like a storm, tearing everything away. Sometimes, it arrived like this patient, sure, a hand held out across the years. And as I banked the fire and turned toward the small bed where Lucy slept, I knew that whatever choice I made would not be shaped by fear. It would be shaped by the life we had already begun, one morning and one kindness at a time. The following evening came with a hush that felt heavier than the snow pressing against the cottage walls. I rose before dawn to gather my thoughts, though none came with the clarity I'd hoped for. All day, I moved through my chores as if my hands belonged to someone else, feeding Lucy, sweeping the kitchen floor, lighting the lamp when dusk slipped in early. But beneath every motion, I felt the knowledge that by nightfall, something in my life would tilt irrevocably, and I could no longer pretend I did not welcome it, or fear it. When Robert's knock finally sounded, it was so soft I thought I might have imagined it. I wiped my palms on my skirt before opening the door. He stood in the drifted snow, his breath a cloud in the lamplight. For the first time since I had known him, he looked almost uncertain. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly as though he needed something to keep them from trembling. I stepped aside, and he entered without speaking. He stood near the stove, the warmth brushing the ice from his coat. I waited, my heart an unsteady thrum in my chest. Outside, the wind moved around the eaves, a low voice I couldn't quite decipher. At last, he lifted his eyes to mine. He said he did not come to make demands or to set terms, only to tell me what was in his heart, so he would not carry the regret of having remained silent. He said he had come to care for Menno out of pity or loneliness, but because he believed there was something in both of us that recognized the other, the part that had survived all the breaking, the part that still knew how to stay. The room felt too small for the words. My hands ached to reach for him, but I stayed still, because I knew that once spoken, nothing would return to what it had been, and maybe it wasn't meant to. When I finally found my voice, it surprised me how steady it sounded. I told him I believed what he said, that I did not doubt his kindness or the truth of his wanting. But I also told him I was not certain whether I knew how to begin again without losing myself to someone else's keeping. He did not flinch or look away. He only nodded, as though he had known my answer before I spoke it. He said that whatever I decided, he would remain nearby. That he would come if I called. And if I never called, he would still wish me well all the days of his life. It was then, in that quiet, that something inside me broke open, not in the way it had in the years when everything was taken, but in a way that felt almost like grace. A kind of sorrow that was inseparable from hope. I understood that no choice would spare me from longing, and no promise would ever undo all that had been lost. When Robert turned to leave, he paused on the threshold. For a moment, I thought he might speak again, but he only looked past me to where Lucy slept in the corner, her small hand resting on her cheek. Then he stepped into the night, the door closing softly behind him. I stood there, long after he was gone. The lamplight flickered over the table, illuminating the blue ribbon he had given Lucy, coiled neatly where I had left it. I reached for it without thinking, curling it in my palm until my knuckles whitened. It felt like holding something fragile I could not protect, no matter how fiercely I wished to. Outside, the wind rose in earnest, scouring the walls. I crossed the room to the window and looked out into the dark, searching for any sign of Robert's lantern along the road. But there was nothing, only snow swirling in restless patterns, as if the world itself could not decide what to carry forward and what to leave buried. In that moment, I felt the truth settle through me with the cold. That I would wake tomorrow, to the same chores, the same quiet rooms. That Lucy would laugh and ask after Robert, and I would find words to soften the absence. And that perhaps this was all any of us were ever promised, a handful of days where we tried to choose rightly, knowing we would never be certain we had. I pressed my forehead to the glass, letting it cool the heat in my skin. For a moment, I closed my eyes and wished, with all that was left in me, that I had been braver, that I had known how to accept love without needing to measure its cost. But the wish was no use, and it slipped away as swiftly as it came. When I turned back to the room, the lamplight looked different, smaller somehow. Or maybe it was simply that I had changed in the telling, that I had come to the end of this story and found no neat conclusion waiting, only the quiet ache of knowing some doors open and never close, no matter which side you choose to stand on. And so I stood there in the hush, the blue ribbon clutched in my hand, the wind rising around me, knowing the night would pass, and morning would come, but unsure whether I would ever again be the woman who believed the simple act of staying could save her from the ghost she carried.